Hey Game Domain, Brett here, and today we're making a video on the same topic we covered in a video back in 2018. And as you already know from the title, it's a ranking the main series of Legend of Zelda games. In this video, I'll be ranking the 18 main series games. No remakes, no games that either aren't out or don't exist yet. So if you're watching this in 2036 when Tears of the Kingdom comes out, it's not out when this video was released. There will be no remakes or spin-offs either. Lastly, I'm ranking these games based on my personal enjoyment with each game, not objectivity or your specific personal enjoyment of each game. That being said, let's get into the video. Number 19, Zelda 2, The Adventures of Link. There's one thing this game is, it's ridiculously difficult. Even at a time when most video games were challenging, this just took it to a whole other level. It was also very different from games in the rest of the series, being mostly a side-scroller. There was the traditional 2D Zelda view as well, but it was just for the overworld, not for towns or dungeons or pretty much anything else. There were also quite a few staples of the series introduced in Zelda 2, like Dark Link and the Magic Meter. The soundtrack, like any Zelda game, also has some bangers, but that's about it for positives in my opinion. The extreme difficulty and how confusing it is just makes it a slog to play through, especially if you don't want to use a guide. If I'd played this back in the NES era, maybe it would be higher, and I could see reasons why someone would put it higher. But I'd say that out of all of the games in the series, I just got the least amount of enjoyment from it. I think possibly remaking it, fixing up the issues, would be a great way to get more people to experience this game, but in an improved form. Number 18, The Legend of Zelda. Why is this gaming classic so low? Simple. It's just not aged well at all. Compared to every following game, it is very simple, doesn't have much of a plot, and like with Zelda 2, it's hard to play without a guide. It's an early NES game, so it's hard to fault it for its limitations, but as someone born in the early 2000s, that's not me, and didn't experience that era of Nintendo, that is me. I just have a hard time playing through this game for more than a few minutes at a time, and a lot of that time is just spent wandering around with no direction. And while you can argue that it is a good thing, as you will find things you wouldn't have found otherwise, there isn't a whole lot going on. You'll mainly just find enemies and every now and then stumble upon a dungeon. It's still important to recognize the original for the groundwork it laid for the series, and for gaming in general, but judging the game by itself, the entire series pretty much just has improved on this formula and overall been more interesting, which is why it's 17 on this list. Number 17, Triforce Heroes. This is one of the newest games in the series, and the most recent main series 2D game, not counting remakes. It's also one of the only 3 main series Zelda games to be multiplayer. This came out during a really rough period of time for Nintendo, when there really wasn't much to look forward to. Super Mario Maker had just come out and was great. Splatoon came out that year, and a handful of other quality games had been released in the past year. However, by this point, the Wii U era was ending, and most of the best 3DS games had already been released. Triforce Heroes was a fun game, but it didn't really feel like a main series Zelda game. One of the big focuses of the game are the cosmetics you can wear, which also each have their own abilities they give you. Okay, that's interesting, I guess. There is a hub world you go to called Hytopia, where you have all the stores and places, and of course, where you actually go for matchmaking. You have 3 options for how to play. You can play solo, and have these creepy, lifeless Link dolls you can swap your control over, random online matching, or you can play with friends both locally or online. I remember this time very vividly, as I played it when it came out. I was still in school at the time, and a lot of us used to carry our 3DSs around, mostly for Street Pass when that was a thing, and Smash 3DS. But when Triforce Heroes came out, I would play it with some friends when we had time, or I'd bring it to a friend's to play. That's the type of game it is. A casual pick up and play for a bit of game that you didn't need to take too seriously. There are games that should be like that, but I just don't really like it as a Zelda game. It has a pretty bare-bones story, and had really nothing outside of fairly simple dungeons. Plus, if you played it with randoms, you had a very limited means of communication. There was no chat or voice, just a few reactions you could do. Overall, I just feel this did not do it for a Zelda game, and while I still get some enjoyment out of it, it's definitely not one of the weakest games in the series. Number 16, Four Swords. As you might be able to tell, I'm not a big fan of the multiplayer games in the series. Unlike Triforce Heroes, where you could play it online or connect wirelessly to play local, Four Swords only has local play, and you need to have GBA link cables. If you can find 3 other people with GBAs and link cables who also have Four Swords with them, you may just be able to experience this game. But how is this game itself, you may be asking? It's interesting to say the least. It has randomly generated dungeons and takes place very early on in the Zelda timeline. Its story elements are definitely stronger than Triforce Heroes, and I overall just like the gameplay better. A lot of my criticisms for Four Swords are similar to Triforce Heroes, so I don't want to dwell on it too long. But as for why I'm putting it higher, I just think the gameplay is more fun and has more replay value. This is another game I think deserves another chance on a newer console. Even though it's not one of my favorite Zelda games, all Nintendo would need to do is port it to the Switch and add online play, so more people can get a chance to experience a game they may not have been able to play. Number 15, Four Swords Adventures. You probably could have seen this coming from the previous 2 entries. Contrary to popular belief, Adventures is not a direct sequel to Four Swords. It takes place well after it on the timeline. Still, it is very similar to its predecessor, but makes the improvements you think it would, being on a much stronger console, the GameCube, compared to the GBA. The goal of the game is to get enough Force Gems to empower the Four Sword. Once you get enough gems, you then move on to the next stage. It's once again a more episodic game, and unlike what its name suggests, it's not as adventurous as the more open Zelda games, and it's just really linear. Number 14, Phantom Hourglass. This is a sequel to the very popular GameCube title, Legend of Zelda Wind Waker, that was released for the DS in 2007. The game is mostly controlled by using the touchscreen on the DS touchscreen, which actually works surprisingly well, but I still do prefer using button controls primarily. Like with Wind Waker, there are different islands you travel to by using a boat, and it's obviously gonna be a lot more limited than its predecessor. One of my main issues with the game is the Temple of the Ocean King, which is a timed dungeon you need to keep coming back to progress. It got old pretty fast. The dungeons in general are just a lot more linear and shorter than the series norm. The game is still well designed, and it was obvious a lot of work went into it to take advantage of Nintendo's new touchscreen hardware, and there are plenty of things I do like about the game. It looks great for a DS game, the exploration is fun, and just because the dungeons are more linear does not mean they're bad at all. This is still a game you should play if you have a DS or a 3DS, as it's still a very enjoyable experience. Number 13, Oracle of Seasons. Nintendo went the Pokemon route with the Oracle games, as they released 2 similar games at the same time. That of course being Oracle of Seasons and Oracle of Ages, which we'll get to soon. These games both seem to go anywhere on Zelda rankings. I've seen people rank them as high as top 5, and others rank them towards the bottom. Both of them are great games, and by this point on the list, all of these games are great. There is a reason the Zelda series has either the highest or one of the highest average review score per game. Anyway, Oracle of Seasons' premier gameplay mechanic is being able to change the season, which changes the overworld and what you can do in it. Compared to Ages, it's more action-focused, and I'd say easier as well. If you enjoy the classic Zelda formula, you will very much enjoy this game. Number 12, Oracle of Ages. Not too much more to say after just talking about Seasons, but I overall just prefer Ages over Seasons because it gives more of a challenge and has more puzzle solving. I also like the time travel mechanic more than the ability to change the seasons, but don't get me wrong, both are still very interesting. Both games have 8 dungeons, with most of them being very well made in each, and you can't go wrong with either of these games. Number 11, Spirit Tracks. Spirit Tracks is very similar to Phantom Hourglass with the same art style, controls, timeline, and also a dungeon you keep going back to. Fortunately, it is much better than the Temple of the Ocean King, as you have stairs to go on instead of going through each floor again, like in Phantom Hourglass. There's also a train you use to travel this time, which I like a lot better than a boat. It overall just takes what its predecessors did and polished it up, just made it into a better game. Number 10, Link's Awakening. A lot of you have probably only played Link's Awakening on the Switch, with the remake, but regardless of what version you play, this is a fantastic game that feels a lot different than other 2D Zelda games. It starts with Link getting stranded on a mysterious island with a giant egg atop a mountain. There's a twist at the end also, that most of you probably know since the game came out a very long time ago, but I won't spoil it here. Mario enemies make an appearance in Awakening as well, which is weird to see. It contributes to just a really strange vibe you get on the island. The music that plays is a big factor in that feeling, as it meshes so perfectly with the environment. It is a Game Boy game, so I can see why a lot of people might not want to play it, but the remake is the definitive way to play, and it looks amazing. Number 9. Skyward Sword. The second most recent 3D Zelda game, and the newest to receive a remaster. Skyward Sword is my least favorite 3D Zelda game, but I still think it is a great game that just happens to have a lot of flaws. It's way too linear for a Zelda game, especially a 3D one. It feels like you're going from point A to point B, instead of exploring and finding your way to where you need to go. The motion controls also feel pretty forced, and it's a good thing we have a remaster now to mend some of the issues, but I'm just talking about the original. Some games on the Wii, like the Galaxy games, had motion controls, but it hardly felt forced. You shook a controller to spin, and pointed it at the screen to collect star bits. The game for the most part still feels like a traditionally controlled Mario game. Skyward Sword, on the other hand, does not. The precise motion controls are not exactly the most precise, and it just feels extremely forced, and while it certainly doesn't make the game unplayable, it is a pretty big annoyance, to put it lightly. Then we also have Fi, who just... yeah. I feel like I'm just finding the negatives for Skyward Sword, but there's still a lot to like. The art style is great. It's like a mix of Twilight Princess and Wind Waker. The proportions are realistic, but it still has that sort of cel-shaded style. The story is one of the more interesting, being the first game on the Zelda timeline. A little off topic, but just something you may not have known. There's a manga that shows the original incarnation of Link, which is obviously before Skyward Sword, but there's not been a game with those events. Anyway, back to Skyward Sword. Just because the game is linear does not make it bad. The dungeons are still well designed, and it introduces new mechanics to spice up the gameplay. You get to see the surface before it's really inhabited, which I found really interesting. This is also the second most athletic Link, as he can sprint and do a parkour jump off a wall to go up onto a higher ledge. All in all, Skyward Sword is a great game with some glaring issues, and if you have a Switch, the remaster is definitely the improved version of it. Number 8. Minish Cap. Who would have thought one of the best 2D Zelda games wasn't even developed by Nintendo? Capcom developed it for the GBA, and it's one of the most underrated games in the series. There's no remake or master of it. Minish Cap is the second game on the Zelda timeline, and has a really intriguing gimmick, the ability to shrink to the size of an ant. You do this to traverse, and it turns things you would never think to be dangerous into enemies and hazards on your adventure. It looks amazing as well, even all these years later. It takes full advantage of the GBA's power to have great looking sprites and backgrounds. The combat is smooth, the dungeons are fun and employ your new abilities to make them unique, and I can't really say enough good things about it. I don't have many major criticisms, I just prefer the games that are higher up on the list. Number 7. A Link to the Past. It's a link to the past. What else is there to say? This is basically the 2D version of Ocarina of Time, as it brought so many staples into the series, like the Master Sword, Kakariko Village, Lake Hylia, musical instruments to play, and so much more. There's a reason this is one of the few 2D Zelda games I like better than a 3D one. It's just a masterclass of game design, even all these years later. It basically gives everything you could ask for out of a 2D Zelda game. Its atmosphere, dungeons, story, puzzles, characters, and it introduces a second world. Nintendo basically remade this game with the next entry on our list. Number 6, A Link Between Worlds. There really isn't much more to say about A Link Between Worlds. It's a newer and improved version of A Link to the Past, basically with a different story, and now the ability to turn into a painting and move through walls. My main criticism is that it just doesn't feel that much like a new game beyond the fresh coat of paint, but it definitely is an improvement over the game it takes inspiration from. Number 5, Twilight Princess. Twilight Princess was made the way it was due to the reaction to the cartoonish and bright graphics of its predecessor, Wind Waker. It not only had a more quote-unquote realistic art style, but also went for a really dark tone like in Majora's Mask. Besides a lot of the main characters whose character designs look good, a lot of the characters look right out of the uncanny valley. Twilight Princess also is not as dark as Majora's Mask, as I'll explain soon enough on the list, but regardless, this is still a fantastic game for all its faults. The soundtrack has so many tracks that fit perfectly, and it has some amazing dungeons. I thought all of them were at least passable. Arbiter's Grounds and Snow Peak Ruins are two of my favorites due to their uniqueness and overall layout. Your companion in the game, Midna, is one of the better in the series, and the combat feels really good as well. Number 4, Majora's Mask. The 3DS remaster is actually one of the first Zelda games I played as I got into the series in the early 2010s, and it really got me to become a big Zelda fan. Actually, my first Zelda game was the OG, and I played Majora's Mask on the N64. After this, I immediately played many of the other games in the series that I was able to. Majora's Mask is what Twilight Princess tried to be. Still a great game irregardless, but while Twilight Princess is dark on the surface, Majora's Mask, like onions or ogres, has layers. A very popular theory is that the game is meant to represent the 5 stages of grief. You also see the citizens of Termina slowly start to accept their fate as the days go on. Another popular theory is that Link is actually dead during the game, and that's a theory we're just not going to get into now, but it's interesting nonetheless. Besides this being a very dark game, it, like any other Zelda game, has an amazing soundtrack. It has one of my personal favorites in the series. It also has a bevy of new areas since it doesn't take place in Hyrule. Clocktown is a great example. While Majora only has 4 main dungeons, 3 of them are amazing, and even the water dungeon isn't too bad either. Even though there are only 4 dungeons, there are so many side quests that can keep you busy for hours with a good amount of them giving you pretty good rewards. Perhaps my favorite part of Majora's Mask is the ability to turn into different species from the Zelda universe, like a Zora, a Goron, and a Deku shrub. Ocarina of Time did have masks, but not anything close to this extent. Finally, besides masks, the other most important feature of this game is the time system, which gives you 72 hours before the moon collides into Termina, destroying everything, giving you a sense of urgency, which is something that I haven't really yet seen in too many other video games. You could make a lot of progress on something, only to have it more or less restart because you took too long. Most impressively, this game was made with a very strict deadline, being less than 2 years. That's like 10 years less than how long it takes Nintendo to make a 3D Zelda now. Number 3, Wind Waker. This at one point was actually my favorite Zelda game, and still fairly close, but as of now, it's number 3 on my list. Even almost 20 years later, this game still looks great due to its cel-shaded graphics. It actually got a very mixed reception at the time, since people were expecting a more realistic looking Zelda experience, not a cartoony one. As time has gone on, the style has gotten a lot more popular with Breath of the Wild seeming to take some inspiration from it. Wind Waker doesn't just look good, it also plays great. You sail across the sea, which made this at the time, and really until Breath of the Wild, the most expansive Zelda game. Instead of just taking place mostly in one mainland area, Wind Waker has islands separated by the vast sea, with plenty of things to find underwater on your journey. I also really love the dungeons for the most part, as they feel different than typical Zelda dungeons, and really, mostly were great. The story feels a lot more personal this time, as you're trying to rescue your sister. Ganon is different as well, as he doesn't seem as ruthless as he has been in the past. I don't want to get into too many spoilers, but let's just say he's very different compared to his Ocarina of Time counterpart. There's a lot of new and interesting characters, with my favorite being your companion, the King of Red Lions, who unlike some other companions is not annoying. Overall, Wind Waker is arguably the greatest Zelda game, but I think it just falls short of the next 2. If you've not played Wind Waker yet, You can play it on the GameCube, Wii, or Wii U with the version I recommend, which is of course the HD remaster. Number 2, Ocarina of Time. A common argument for having Ocarina as the highest rated Zelda game, or one of the highest rated, is nostalgia blindness or following the popular opinion. I didn't even play Ocarina of Time until the past 7 or 8 years, and it was not the first Zelda game I played. That's not me! As for the graphics and clunkiness of it, I just fail to see how that automatically makes it a bad game. It's a product of its time, and if the graphics bother you so much, just try the 3DS version. Ocarina is number 2 on my list, and is rated so highly on many others because it is one of the best designed games of all time, and was also one of the most innovative games of all time. Besides a couple of dungeons, one of them having a focus on H2O, they are masterfully designed. The overworld is personally one of my favorites, and it's different depending on if you're adult Link or young Link. There was also a good amount of puzzles throughout the game that were just so seamless in how they were implemented. It's really hard to explain why this now 20-plus-year-old game is one of the best games of all time. But if you haven't played it, just give it a try on the 3DS at least. Number 1, Breath of the Wild. I know with Breath of the Wild, some people will be mad that it's number 1, and I really went back and forth on whether I wanted to put it number 1 or 2, and my list could still change at some point. Breath of the Wild has some flaws. The dungeons are really disappointing, and the story isn't the best, but what carries it to number 1 is its gameplay. This game is just so fun. You can do whatever you want and use the advanced physics system to pull off some crazy tricks. You can go anywhere you want and glide across the world. There's over 100 shrines to complete, and with each one, you get an orb which you can use to upgrade Link. The amount of content in this game is just unreal, and can easily take you over 100 hours to beat if you want to do everything the game has to offer. Also, in an age where most games are fairly easy, Breath of the Wild is a pretty challenging game, but it by no means feels unfair. If you're having a lot of trouble, you can increase your health, weaponry, armor, or craft more meals to aid you. Speaking of armor, you can change your clothes and it's not just cosmetic. Some clothes help you survive in the cold, others in the heat, others will disguise you. Breath of the Wild really is a modern day version of the original Legend of Zelda, and I cannot wait for the sequel to come out. I could make a whole hour-long video just talking about Breath of the Wild and what makes it a masterpiece, but I'll leave it at that.
Before we get to number 1, you were probably just wondering where Brett went. He recorded most of this video but was unavailable for the release of Tears of the Kingdom, so I'm just stepping in to read this. I kind of gave away what number 1 is, and you already know it's Tears of the Kingdom. And don't worry, there won't be any spoilers. Even though this game literally just came out, it's just a better version of Breath of the Wild. It doesn't necessarily reinvent the wheel like Breath of the Wild did, but it still adds so much and is just like its predecessor on steroids. The addition of the Sky Islands and new abilities like Recall and the Ultra Hand just add a whole new layer, both with exploration and interacting with the environment. A big complaint with Breath of the Wild was the lack of traditional dungeons, as it just had the 4 divine beasts which lacked anything unique and were overall just pretty basic. But without spoiling anything, Tears of the Kingdom adds more dungeons with more distinct details in each. As for the story, well, at least in my opinion, it definitely is an improvement over its predecessor, but I don't feel like it's a top-tier Zelda story. The game being non-linear just kind of makes it difficult to get to that elite level. To be honest, when deciding where to put Tears of the Kingdom, part of me didn't want to put it at number 1 since it's just super fresh in my mind and I hadn't had time to really let it stand the test of time, but it's just objectively phenomenal. And since Breath of the Wild held up and is still a very similar game, at least mechanically, I have no doubts it will hold up. To sum it up, Tears of the Kingdom isn't the most innovative game on the list, but it just took what was already my favorite game in the Zelda series and cranked it up to 11. It added tons more content while fixing most of the glaring issues. It took 4 years from announcement to release, similar to Breath of the Wild, but it was absolutely worth it, and I look forward to the next Zelda game in 2030.
Well, if you're still here, it's most likely for one of two reasons. Either you really enjoyed the video, and if you did, please like, comment, and subscribe, as it does help us out. Or you may still be here if you're angry because this list wasn't exactly the same as yours. Don't worry, mine too. Can't expect every single person to agree on a list. If that's the case, then why watch ranking videos in the first place? We all grew up with different games and have different preferences. No one's wrong because they like a game better than another, so please keep it civil in the comments with each other. That being said, this has been Brett with Game Domain. Have a good one.